So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here for our speaker series that we're resuming. This began in fall 2023. This is our weekly speaker series, Civil Society Organizations and Ukrainian Resilience. We're very appreciative to have a very good sized audience today and a growing audience in our Zoom webinar, because I think, as this audience likely knows, of course, we've reached now the 2-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and a time at which there are questions about U.S. support for Ukraine. There are questions about continuing to support Ukraine. And many people are stepping up to do that, but a time at which we don't want to forget Ukraine, that we want to remember what's going on there. And so we're enormously grateful to have an audience of people watching us today. This is set up as a Zoom webinar, which is a bit less personal, unfortunately, but you can communicate with us easily using the Q&A function. The chat is disabled, but the Q&A function is a great way to get in touch with us if you're having any technical issues, any questions at all about the webinar. And again, the website is in the chat. You can see the link there to the website for our speaker series. This is co-sponsored by the University of Colorado Boulder, by isar.ednannia, a nonprofit organization based in Kyiv. And we have Olha Nikolska with us here as a representative of isar.ednannia. We have Jeffrey Glenn with the Peace Corps Virtual Service based in Dubno, Ukraine. And we have Roman Oleksiy, who will be our moderator today, and who's a community project manager based in Kyiv, Ukraine. We're very excited to welcome Professor Olexiy Haran from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, who will be talking with us today, and also Peter Dickinson, who will be here shortly from the Atlantic Council. And our topic today, and there he is, just as I speak here. We also have Peter Dickinson from the Atlantic Council, and we'll be discussing today dispelling myths about Ukraine. Persistent myths from before the full-scale invasion, from before the territorial invasion in 2014, but also new myths that have arisen since the full-scale invasion. We will have time for Q&A at the end. And as I said, you can use the Q&A function in this webinar at any time. If you're having technical issues or you have a question, we will see those there. So again, welcome, and thank you so much for joining. At this point, I'll turn things over to Roman, who will introduce our two speakers in more detail, and we'll begin the discussion about dispelling myths about Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'd like to welcome our keynote speakers, and they are Olexiy Haran, who is the professor of comparative politics at the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, who's also research director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And we're very thrilled to have him as one of the speakers here and one of the experts. We're also joined by Peter Dickinson, a good friend of mine and a British journalist who has been living in Ukraine since the late 90s. Peter is an editor who's been based in Ukraine for a while, like I said, for over 20 years now. And he is currently a publisher of Business Ukraine magazine and editor of the Atlantic Council's UkraineAlert service. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to share your thoughts with us today. I would also like to thank our audience for joining. As you know, Ukraine is going through a very extremely difficult period since the full-scale invasion. And your attendance today means a lot to us, Ukrainians. And like Sarah mentioned, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you may have. I'd like to begin with a disclaimer about the use of the term myth that we're going to talk about today. We've had previous sessions focused on Russian disinformation and propaganda, and some of you who've attended those sessions may find this a little bit repetitive, but I think we're going to explore it a little bit from a different angle. And I propose that in our discussion today, we use the term myth broadly to examine, all shades of meanings as they relate to Ukraine. We're also going to explore various ecosystems where these myths thrive, and some of them differ. I also anticipate us using the terms as synonyms, basically, as preconceived notions, preconceptions, narratives, even disinformation and propaganda throughout our conversation. So let's start with some personal stories, because we love starting with personal stories, about our keynote speakers. We want to make this as interactive as possible. We see how we go with this. And I would like to basically to ask our keynote speakers to share their personal stories relating to dispelling myths about Ukraine that they've had. We know that, Oleksiy and I were born in Soviet Ukraine, basically the Soviet Empire, if you will, and Peter were born in the former British Empire. And I'm sure that in your lifetimes, you have had to dispel many myths about Ukraine, which have, increasingly being referred to as, as post-colonial. Could you please share some of your most memorable or significant ones that, from your background, from your experience? Oleksiy, we would like to start with you.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you for organizers and for those people who come actually, who are interested in getting some new information about Ukraine, what's going on. I will start with, so I'm the product of the Soviet system, which means that I'm a Russified Ukrainian, and I believed in all the communist dogmas at that time. I wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but I believed in communism. I believed in the idea of the world revolution. I wanted to bring this revolution to other countries, including Latin America, maybe United States. So I think that you should be very happy that my dreams were not realized, because you don't know actually what communism is. So this is dictatorship. Very nice words, very romantic ideas, and that's why many people believe it. But in essence, when you try to realize it, you have dictatorship, and this was in all the countries which followed the idea of which had the communist governing parties. It's not only the Soviet Union, it's China, it's Vietnam, it's not to say about Khmer Rouge, it's North Korea, Cuba, even those countries in Africa which also tried to use Marxist models. All this led to terror and to starvations because the system didn't work. So this is the first point. The second point is that I'm Russified Ukrainian, which means that ethnically my family is mixed. So father Ukrainian from the village, my mother Russian from the town, so I'm mixed. And we spoke Russian language in our family. So, and when I asked my father, why did you send me to Russian speaking school, he explained it very simply. He said, you need to know Russian for your career, not Ukrainian. So basically, after graduating from the school, I couldn't speak fluent Ukrainian. But nevertheless, this is important to understand, even for these people like me, when those who were Russified, we knew even at that time that we are not Russians. I mean, Russians in Russia. You see? So that we are Ukrainians. And this is important to understand. So when the time comes, many of these peoples, including myself, we switch to Ukrainian language, and we have no problems with ethnic Russians who are living in Ukraine. Because ethnic Russians who are living in Ukraine, they know Ukrainian language, they are part of Ukrainian political nation. So basically, for you it may be strange when we speak to each other, we don't know who are you. Are you Russian or Ukrainian? We do not ask this question. So basically, people communicate. They may communicate in Ukrainian, they may communicate in Russian, but the main thing is that we feel that we are citizens of Ukraine. And Ukraine is different from Russia. It's a separate country with very long history and cultural traditions.
Thank you, Oleksiy. Peter, what's your story of dispelling myths about Ukraine?
And
Peter, are you there?
unmute yourself, please.
Okay, we're having some.
Hi, is that it? Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I would like to begin by looking back to my personal experience 10 years ago, at the time of the siege of Crimea and the start of the war, in fact. At the time, I was asked to set up an English language TV station here in Ukraine, within the 1+1 TV channel holding. So probably some of our audience here will be familiar. It's one of the main TV channels in Ukraine, and it was Mr. Kolomoisky, the oligarch who owns the holding. Then he rather mischievously wanted to call it Ukraine Today to sort of troll on the Russians and Russia Today. So we set up this channel in the spring and summer of 2014. When it was already very obvious that a major information war was taking place. And at the time, Ukraine was losing very badly because Russia had a huge information apparatus in place. It had enormous amounts of influence internationally. It had its own platforms. It had the Russia Today, the RT platform. It also had various other state platforms in different languages, and it had huge connections throughout the international media. Not even to mention the large number of correspondents who were located in Moscow who were covering the news in Ukraine. So there was obviously a huge problem with disinformation, and the information coming out of Russia was wildly distorted. It was in many ways reminiscent of what we see today. The talk of Ukrainian Nazis, of Russian speakers being oppressed, etc., etc. So when we established this Ukrainian TV channel, one of our main focuses from day one was to combat this disinformation about Ukraine. We also worked closely. Again, many of the audience may remember this also was the time when some of Ukrainian civil society established the Stop Fake initiative, which at the time was absolutely revolutionary. It was a really very original initiative to try and combat Russian disinformation. So we were following on from that, and we dedicated quite a lot of time to debunking Russian false narratives and explaining why they were false, explaining why they were ridiculous, and so on. And what I found was, first of all, the first thing to note is that the international community had almost zero knowledge of Ukraine, almost zero. I mean, it was essentially a blank sheet of paper. So Russia was able to put anything on it. In this case, Nazis, oppression, etc. They're Russians in reality. All the narratives we're familiar with, and most international audiences were quite ready to accept this because they had no knowledge of Ukraine. They had no understanding of what Ukraine really is and what it represents. They had no historical context of Ukraine's long independent struggle, statehood struggle, etc. So they were very ready to accept what Russia said. That was the first big problem. But the second big problem, I think, was a matter of audience penetration. We found that when we began, we were quite naive and we thought, well, Russia's lying. So if we expose Russia's lies, that will be it. We'll be able to defeat them. The light will shine on the darkness and all will be well. In reality, that was not the case. As a general rule, a piece of Russian disinformation, a report, could garner millions of views on different platforms, could reach a very wide international audience, whereas the report debunking it and exposing why it was false may perhaps reach thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, but far, far less people would see it. And it soon became clear after a few months of this that chasing after Russian lies and disinformation was not a very effective way of addressing this very serious problem. In fact, it was not futile entirely. There were occasional moments where we felt we'd made an impact, and certainly where sometimes our efforts were picked up by the international media. But generally speaking, it was like a mouse trying to fight an elephant. People were very, very easily persuaded by the Russian disinformation and were not necessarily very interested in listening to debunking stories. So I think the key lessons I learned, one is that you need to have a loud voice, you need to have a good platform, but also you need to engage with people. Coming to people and telling them that what they believe is a lie is not particularly exciting. One of the areas where Russia excels, and I think we need to recognize that Russia is a world superpower in the sphere of disinformation. They are maybe the superpower, maybe the most professional and most sophisticated disinformation machine in the world, maybe that we've ever even seen. They're very good at packaging. If you watch Russian disinformation, if you watch it from a Ukrainian background, you will be struck by the fact that it's not true. But if you watch it without a Ukrainian background and without the necessary knowledge, you'll probably be struck by the fact that it's very engaging, very interesting. It has Hollywood-style production qualities often, whereas what we were doing was a much more basic operation with people simply explaining why it was false. So it does matter how you tell your stories. It does matter how you put them across. I think this is a very important lesson that Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine can take on board. But my big takeaway would be, instead of trying to debunk Russian narratives, or instead of focusing specifically on debunking Russian narratives, I think it's very important for Ukraine to tell its own story, because Ukraine has a very compelling story that can be put to international audiences, and they are very receptive to that. I think this was very clear if we jump forward from 2014 to 2022, on the eve of the full-scale invasion, when a large number of journalists came to Ukraine because the Biden White House was signaling to the world that a major war was about to begin. A large number of journalists came to Ukraine who were not Moscow correspondents, who were not Russia specialists who were asked to cover Ukraine, who simply were journalists coming to Ukraine, and they engaged with Ukrainian stories and Ukrainian narratives, and the coverage in the international media changed dramatically. And I think this was a big factor why, when the war did begin, there was so much international support and sympathy for Ukraine, and Russia suffered its first major defeat in the information war because Ukraine's story is compelling. So I think that's my personal take, is that it can be very difficult to debunk lies once they've been released and put into the public sphere, and B, it's a lot more effective often to tell a compelling story rather than come along and try and convince people that what they've believed is not true.
Thank you, and we will get to maybe later at our meeting, we will get to maybe some of the recommendations about Ukraine telling its own story, like what would be the most effective ways to do it. But you mentioned talking to various international media, and I know Oleksiy has been as well. Before we get to the three different geographical areas, and I hate to generalize it, but the three geographical areas are the former Soviet Union, the collective West, and the global South, because that's where we think there are some major differences in myths about Ukraine. But before we do that, I would like to ask you if you've had any interesting experiences talking to Western media and maybe observing some of the patterns with regards to myths that they may have about Ukraine. Say, are questions coming from an Arab media any different from questions about Ukraine coming from one of the Asian countries, or maybe in the West? Can you talk a little bit about that? Or maybe I'm barking the wrong tree here. Oleksiy, what's your experience been like talking to various international media and possibly observing certain patterns?
Oh, you're
Well,
muted.
this is now. No, is it okay?
Yeah,
It's okay now. Okay, good. Shukran. If we are talking about Global South. Look, I would say that let me a little bit follow to what Peter has said. I think that, for example, by 2014, there were quite a lot of expert community in the West who followed and started to understand what's going on in Ukraine. So I mean among academics, for example. So there were specialists who were following Ukraine, who wrote books about Ukraine. The first interest, I would say, skyrocketed after the Orange Revolution and definitely after 2014. Still, I would say that before full-scale invasion, many people, in the West and also among policymakers and journalists, they were following the line of, okay, you have a conflict, but when you have a conflict, what do you need? You need mediation, you need negotiation, you need to find some compromises from different sides. Maybe Ukraine should find a dialogue with Russian-speaking East. That's it. Kind of, there are sources, domestic sources of this conflict. I think that invasion of many people believed actually in Minsk agreements, which were of compromise nature. There were some things that were positive for Ukraine. There were some things that were negative for Ukraine. But basically, since 2014, there was no ceasefire. Minsk agreements proclaimed ceasefire since 2014, but there was no ceasefire. And before full-scale invasion, Putin himself, he canceled Minsk agreement. He said, no, I'm not going to follow it. And he declared his aims very clearly, and everybody actually has seen it, what's going on, the open, non-provoked Russian aggression. And I think this was definitely, a turning point for many, even for policymakers, for journalists, definitely. So as Peter said, there was a lot of sympathy to Ukraine, and everybody who wanted to see what's going on, they understood that this is non-provoked Russian aggression against sovereign country. And the change happened also with many European politicians. Germans, they turned, their position from kind of not sending weapons, being to the war zone, being, at equal distance from Moscow and Ukraine. The same for Macron, the same for Italy, so people started to change their mind. But if we are talking about the global south, the situation was a bit different. Russia would like to portray it that, look, there is the West and other countries of the world, non-West, that non-West is supporting Russia. This is actually not the case, and I would like to show you a map. Just a moment. Okay.
And while Alexei's looking for a map, I'm encouraging everyone on this call to pose their question in the Q&A function.
Okay, share screen. Share screen. Okay. Here you go. Do you see the map?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is the vote in the United Nations on territorial integrity of Ukraine when Russia conducted so-called referendums on the occupied territories. Definitely sham referendums, pseudo referendums under the barrel of the gun. So how the world react? You see in green those who condemned it, who supported fully territorial integrity of Ukraine. In red, very few countries, actually 4 countries supported Russian position. Nicaragua, Syria, North Korea, and Belarus. That's all. Only they supported Russia. Nicaragua, I was so happy about Nicaraguan revolution in 1979. And the revolutionaries appeared to become dictators, pro-Russian dictators, unfortunately. You see in green that actually majority of Latin America supported Ukraine. More than half of African states supported Ukraine. Basically, almost all Arab states supported Ukraine, and such important countries as Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and others. So basically, the result here is 143 against 5. I think this is a very good result. So the issue of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, is important for the global south. But you see that in yellow, there are countries which abstained. And, well, it's understandable about China, because China is benefiting from this war. Russia is becoming a younger partner of China, but also India. And you see South Africa, for example, many African countries. So, well, regarding, Kazakhstan, which abstained, for example, I think that actually this is a victory for Ukrainian diplomacy, because you can imagine what was the pressure on Kazakhstan to support Russia. But they decided no. So their neutrality is demonstration actually that they do not follow the Russian line. But the question is about these countries of global south. So why they decided to abstain? And I think one of the problem is that, first of all, this is deep, anti-Western complex because of the colonialism. They're saying Russia didn't have colonies in Africa, contrary to the West. Okay, so there is this kind of anti-Western approach. And they view the conflict as a conflict between, in terms of Cold War, that this is a conflict between expanding NATO and Russia. And I believe further we will talk more about this NATO argument, which is not true. But this is how they view this situation. The second main point which they have is that we are neutral, we are non-allied countries. And I think as a student, good student of international relations, I had only excellent marks in the Soviet Union about that. So I know that non-alignment doesn't mean neutrality. The founders of non-alignment movement, they actually were very tough against colonialism, against aggression, and they supported the countries which fought for their independence. So basically, I think it's very logical that these countries should support Ukraine. The third point, as I have mentioned, they viewed the Soviet Union as a friend. It was a complicated situation. Definitely, in times of Cold War, Soviet Union positioned himself as a supporter to anti-colonial movements. This was true. But also, but Soviet Union is not Russia, okay? Russia today is not the Soviet Union. And it's very important to take into account. If Soviet Union, at least formally, was based on the issues of, equality, solidarity, Russian policy now, this is dictatorship, this is ugly capitalism, oligarchy, chauvinism, and aggression. So all this we need to explain in the global south, which is not easy, I would say, because of Russian propaganda, because of this some history, political culture in the global south. Again, many of these countries, they may support territorial integrity of Ukraine, but for example, if they are asked about violations of the human rights in Ukraine, they are not so open about that. Why? Because many of these regimes, frankly speaking, are not democratic, and they have their own violations of human rights. So that's why I would say in global south, this is quite difficult to explain, and Russian propaganda is much more stronger, and they have resources, they have corruption. So for us, for Ukraine, it's more difficult, much more difficult, because our resources are limited. But we have the word of truth, and which we can spread. And if you spread the word of truth, then we may have success. I would mention just here questions from, I'm often guest at different Arab channels, and they use, or Indian channels, and they very often they would like to have two guests in the studio, to have Ukrainian guests and to have Russian guests. And this is very difficult, very tough, because Russians are saying lies, lies, lies. Everything, you know, everything is under control in Russia. And if you have 10-minute conversation and you have only 5 minutes, it's very difficult to give the answer in, you know, to some complicated issues. Finally, what I would say, and this is important not only for the global South, but also for the West, this is the attitude and the position of the left. I don't know why, but the left forces very often, they are more inclined to take Moscow's arguments into account. Again, they think in terms of, oh, this is a socialism. Yes, there were violations of human rights, but nevertheless, it was socialist. And what I would like to say, we need again to explain to the left that today's Russia is ugly capitalism. And left, by the way, starting from Marx, starting from the First International, they always supported the fight of the oppressed nations against imperialism. Even Lenin, he openly said that nationalism of oppressed nations, this is our ally. That's what was Lenin saying, and it's easy to find in all his quotes. So I think when you have this case, Ukrainian-Russian war, when Russia attacked Ukraine, violated all the obligations, trying to say that Ukrainians do not exist, I believe the position of the left should be very natural if they support Ukraine. But it's not always the case, fortunately.
Thank you, Oleksiy, for your very thorough political and historical overview of the Russian influence all over the world. And I completely agree with you. And I would say that Russia has been very successful at catering or customizing their messages and narratives and myths about Ukraine, not only when we speak about the far left, as you've mentioned, but also the far right. And then for every audience, for each and every audience, they seem to have a little bit of a twist. They have like a customized recipe that will like fall, that the narrative will fall in the fertile soil, if you will. And so, Peter, what has your experience been like when talking to various media coming from all over the world? And also maybe it's about time we kind of transition into maybe specific examples of those narratives that permeate or prevail in various parts of the world when we speak about Ukraine and the perception of Ukraine by other countries.
Well, I think Russia's disinformation is like an all-you-can-eat buffet. You know, there's something for everybody. There's something for every taste. You know, if you're a right-wing Christian American, then they've got a nice dish about how Ukraine oppresses the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. You know, if you are very left-wing, then they'll pull out something about Ukrainian sympathies for, you know, World War II Nazi collaborators, for example. There's always something that fits. If you're from the former colonial world, then of course they will emphasize the role of the West and the colonial aspect. If you are sort of center left in the West, they will probably use the NATO narrative to say, well, this is more Western imperialism. So a lot of the time you'll find these different narratives sort of coexisting. And when I'm speaking to international journalists, it's usually very, very easy to understand where they're picking stuff up from by the questions they ask. It's almost immediate, in fact. I mean, there's one of the most obvious things, just a very specific point. But if you look at the way, if it's written journalism, if I read anything and they spell Kyiv with the Russian transliteration Kiev, or they refer to Kharkov or Odessa with two S's, maybe Odessa is an outlier, but if they use the old Russian spellings, if they refer to the Ukraine, you can immediately know that they are getting their information from Russian sources. more or less, because virtually the whole of the international mainstream media has now made that transition to the Ukrainian spelling. That's a minor point, but sometimes quite useful. But yeah, you encounter these different narratives in different environments, and there are many, many of them. I think very broadly speaking, as Olexiy mentions, the global south, the main narrative there is the colonial narrative, the idea that this is a Western imperialist war rather than a Russian imperialist war, sort of turning the whole situation on its head. And that resonates with certain elements within the global south. I think that it's true that a lot of people in the global south are not inclined to engage too openly with what Russia's doing, because they also understand that their countries could easily become, their borders could easily be questioned, and they want to be advocates of redrawing maps by force. But the colonial argument will work there to a degree. In the Western world, the dominant narrative by far is the NATO narrative, the idea of American imperialism. In the post-Cold War world, there has been a significant rise in anti-American sentiment, certainly after the Iraq War. So for the last 20 years, there's widespread resentment of America's role internationally, and even within America itself. This has become something that is often a point that's raised. And I think it was very instructive when Tucker Carlson came to Moscow to interview Putin in February last month. He very clearly, from the very opening line of his interview, he was very clearly wanted Putin to steer the conversation to NATO. His opening question was, so this is basically America and NATO's fault, right? And he was very, very confused when Putin didn't do that, when Putin embarked on a very long historical narrative and then began with all his conspiracies about Ukrainian Nazis. Tucker Carlson didn't understand that, because the way he saw it, this was there was a very good argument, as far as he was concerned, to be made about the NATO issue. He wanted Russia, he wanted Putin himself to make that argument, because Tucker, he could sell that to an American audience, an international audience, a Western audience. And in fact, since then, in recent days, Tucker Carlson's been interviewed, and he's been very critical of that. He's spoken openly. He's saying, like, the NATO argument's great. Why didn't Putin do it? And he said, basically, it was a flop. It was a failure because Putin didn't sell it as he could. Because as far as Tucker Carlson's concerned, that is the argument you use to Western audiences. You blame America, essentially. You blame the West. You say they have provoked Russia into doing this. But internally within Russia, and certainly throughout the former Soviet Union, the argument that dominates is the Nazi argument. This idea of this demonization of Ukrainian national identity, of Ukrainian patriotism, as synonymous with fascism, with Nazism, with the most extreme forms of nationalism. And that doesn't really resonate with Western audiences, because they don't understand what the connection is. And that often leads to trouble with the Russians. In the first months of the war, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was being interviewed on Italian television, and the Italian host said to him very reasonably, so you say Ukrainians are Nazis, but their president is actually Jewish. So how can a Nazi country overwhelmingly elect a Jewish president? And Lavrov had no response to this, obviously, and so he started he blurted out that Hitler had Jewish blood too, so it doesn't mean anything, and this caused huge offence to everybody, especially Israel, but not only. And ultimately, Putin had to sort of intervene and personally apologize to the Israeli government for this comment. But it illustrated how these different narratives don't work for different audiences necessarily. I'm sure the Italian audience would have been very receptive to talk of NATO and American imperialism and American expansionism. But when the issue was the so-called Ukrainian Nazis, it made no sense to them, and they said so. So again, the Italians are saying this then 2 years ago. Tucker Carlson now, I think his quote, in fact, in recent days, that it was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. this Nazi narrative. So that doesn't really work with the West. The NATO narrative works with them. So again, it's a buffet. There's different things for different people, but the Russians get into trouble when they sort of mix up their audiences, and when they confuse their audiences and try and give meat to the vegetarians or vice versa, as it were.
But that's in our in the last years, I mean, we've noticed that that's the Russian tactics to confuse people, to confuse everyone, to disorient everyone. So I don't think they care too much about like they're serving vegetarian dishes to the meat eaters. I think it's just that their goal is to create chaos and misunderstanding. And I don't know if you mentioned Tucker Carlson, if his interview with Putin actually helped Putin deliver his message to the West.
No, I think it was a disaster for Russia. And I think you see that because they've actually been very, the Russians themselves have been critical of it. Tucker Carlson is desperately trying to distance himself from it now. He's gone public. I say, the last couple of days, he made a very long public appearance on a podcast in America talking about it and was very, very critical. I mean, he said, quote unquote, that the Nazi narrative was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. Now, that is very strong language, and I think that's an indication that he's desperate to distance himself from this because he's had a lot of criticism for having done the interview from the American side as a traitor, as it were, as a sort of quisling, as a fifth columnist, but also he understands that it didn't really work. It didn't resonate as he hoped, and in fact, it exposed Putin as a sort of crank, as a sort of a conspiracy theorist with all these weird, essentially these weird conspiracies about imaginary Nazis and these very long historical narratives. Again, people in Russia are persuaded by the historical narrative to a degree. Russians will openly say, no, there is no Ukraine, it's Russia. It's always been Russia. But when you say that internationally to people, you say to someone in France or Germany, oh, well, it used to be Russian, and 500 years ago there was a treaty signed by Cossack hetman, and therefore it's Russia. That just sounds completely absurd to them, and also very, very dangerous, because of course that logic applied to Europe would mean that we'd have nothing but wars. The Poles and the Germans and the French and the Belgians and Hungarians, everyone will be fighting about their historic claims to each other's land and borders.
Exactly. How far down in history do you go to actually to start counting? Yeah.
It's sorry.
Oh, no, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure that Ramon saw there were two questions in the Q&A.
Yeah,
okay, great. And that we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Well, I do have one quick question, and then we'll get to the question from the audience. Peter, and that's going to be a question for Oleksiy. But Peter, you mentioned Israel, and you mentioned Zelensky being Jewish, and kind of like going in contrast to what the Russian propaganda has been saying about Ukraine as a neo-Nazi country, basically. How is Israeli-Gaza war affecting the perception of Ukraine internationally? Because I have friends on both sides of the spectrum, some people who stand with Israel, and they believe that Ukraine is an equivalent of Israel, roughly speaking. And there are other audience. There's another audience that says, well, we stand with Ukraine, but we also stand with the Arabs, with the Gaza. So how do we Ukrainians equate on this perception of Ukraine and Israel or Gaza around the world?
It's to me, yeah.
I would like to start with Oleksiy. If Oleksiy is comfortable answering this question, I would love to hear from him, and then to you, and then we'll get on to the questions.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say that we have not only Jewish president, we also have Minister of Defense, who is Muslim Crimean Tatar. And I think this is the best example that we have what I have said, Ukrainian political nation, which doesn't matter what is your ethnicity and what is your religion, what is your language. I think for Americans, it would be actually easy to understand. Well, basically, you have one language, but we now have also Ukrainian language, which is promoted from below because people would like to switch to Ukrainian. But again, as I have said, it doesn't mean that people who speak other languages, they're excluded from the notion of political nation. So this is important. And we have a joke here that Putin managed to do in Ukraine unimaginable things, that he united Jews and Muslims who are fighting together. And they are, some of them are saying in Russian that we are fighting against Putin for Ukrainian Donbass. And some of them saying it in Russian, because you know that many people from Donbass, they are fighting in Russian army and they are fighting against Putin. Regarding Gaza, well, I think here, look, we are democracy, which means that we may have different views, even among us, among Ukrainians, different views as to this very tragic war. But here I think we need to, the position of Ukraine, I think it was actually very wonderfully explained by one of the statements by our MFA. I am not, a member of the government. I'm criticizing the government all the time. I'm criticizing my president. But I believe the statement was really good because it said that first, Ukraine is in favor of two-state solution. Full stop here. Ukraine condemning terror and war, terrorism and war crimes from whatever side. Full stop. So, and for those who is trying, to say that Ukrainians do not care about Arabs or the case of Palestine, I would give two examples that Ukraine, it was under the Soviet Union, but it recognized the state of Palestine in 1988. Okay, not many countries recognized the state of Palestine such a long time ago. And when Ukraine became independent in 2001, we established full diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine. So, by the way, this embassy is not far from, is very close to the center of the city, in the same building as Swiss embassy, for example. So I think, yes, I believe that what's going on in Gaza definitely diverted attention of many nations from Ukraine to Palestine, to Gaza. So many of these countries are condemning Israel and the United States. So my position here, okay, you condemn the United States, right or wrong, but why don't you condemn Russia when Russia attacks Ukraine openly? Okay, so to South Africans, my dear friends, okay, you apply to International Court of Justice to defend the case of Palestine, but for some reason you abstain in the United Nations on the very simple question, territorial integrity of Ukraine. So when we are talking about the double standards, about Western double standards, I believe there are some double standards also from the global South. And my call to everybody, let's avoid double standards and let's stick to international law. Very simple. We have a country which is recognized by the whole world. Our territorial borders were guaranteed, including by Russia. We gave up nuclear weapons. We officially were a non-bloc country, in 2014. And nevertheless, we were. Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO. Come on. Before 2014, no. We believed in neutrality.
And
Russia violated everything.
Ironically, Russia did want to join the NATO, and Putin said it, especially emphasized that in the interview with Tucker Carlson, which is again,
yeah.
My philosophy is that they try to get in NATO is to basically to divide and conquer from within. Basically to divide the alliance and to be able to get away with everything, just like
may I show one diagram, because I think it's very important for, again, let me share screen with you. Share screen. Okay. Look, because I love it, this graph. Let me show it to you. So look, Ukrainians wanted to have good relations with everyone. So Ukrainians wanted to join the EU, and at the same time, they wanted to be in union with Russia and Belarus. Okay? So this was before 2014. So the red line is about union with Russia and Belarus. At the same time, Ukrainians wanted to join the EU. You know, we call it geopolitical ambivalence. So, but you see that basically Ukrainians were not anti-Russian at all, red line. And then collapse. When it happened? 2014. And the same is, and now people say no. And the same is about NATO. Blue line is support for NATO. So you see in 2012, only about 12% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. Most, green line, wanted to be non-bloc, which was proclaimed. Okay, and again, everything changed after Russian attack in 2014. Support for NATO skyrocketed, and now it's skyrocketed even more. Why? Because Russia violated it. And all the obligations. What Putin is saying, let's make Ukraine neutral. Okay, we were a neutral country and you attacked us. So it didn't work for some reason, this concept of neutrality of Ukraine. So let's think about other mechanisms, which may be, let's discuss, but it's clear that being neutral doesn't save us from Russian aggression. Vice versa, it provokes Russian aggression because Russia sees a vacuum which it can feel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Oleksiy. Peter, if you have anything to add to this, please feel free, but only if you only have like a very short comment, because we have, I think, 5 questions lined up. Okay. We have a question from a friend of mine who happens to have the same last name as me, even though we're not relatives. What strategies should Ukraine employ to flip countries that express neutrality in its favor? Again, what strategies or which strategies should we use to employ? Should Ukraine employ to flip countries that express neutrality in its favor? Peter, would you like to handle this question?
I can do it as well. Yeah.
Okay, Oleksiy, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. As I have said, from their own history, it's not because most of these countries they were former colonies. So, and we need to change the narrative. So it's not the proxy war. It's our anti-colonial war against former colonial empire, which is trying to come back. And Putin is openly saying for decades that we do not exist. Ukrainians do not exist separately from Russia. So this is our fight for our very existence, for our freedom. It's not about territory. This is anti-colonial war. So first point. Second point, I have already mentioned that non-alignment always supported the fight of against aggression and the fight against colonialism. Basically, this is a history of non-alignment. And, you know, again, I remember how we were happy when independence came into the country to former Portuguese colonies, when South Africa became free country. We were so happy at that time. We started with Africans. We were so happy when democracies were established in Latin America. And actually, Ukraine actively supported all this pro-independence movement and democratic movement. So now we are asking for your solidarity. Please support us. And we can talk for those countries who are neutral about some things which are important for them pragmatic. This is not about, you know, the general solution, you know, what would happen, what are the terms of peace. But let's discuss very practical things. The thing about nuclear safety, because never ever in history foreign power occupied nuclear power plant. And nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia is the largest in Europe. Why do they need it? Only for nuclear blackmail. There's no military reason for that. And imagine if anything happens there. So because Chernobyl is a child compared to Zaporizhia. So this is in the interest of the whole world if Russia withdraw its soldiers from nuclear power station. As simple as that, and they could be replaced by international experts, for example. We are talking about food security. We are talking about ecological security. So all these things are important for these countries, for the whole world. By the way, if we are talking to Muslim countries, again, the fate of Muslim Crimean Tatars. I was surprised that in some Muslim countries, people do not know about the fate of Crimean Tatars. So it's necessary, to tell them about it. Some countries are very receptive to the issue of human rights, the issue of children, of deportations. I've a bit criticized South African approach, but regarding this issue, the deportation of children, and in general, deportations, they are very active about it in this question. As I have mentioned also, Qatar and Emirates, which are not very democratic country, but they are doing, they're making their contribution here. Okay. So if you do not fully support Ukraine, nevertheless, there are cases which are important for all, for the whole world. So let's do it together.
Thank you, Oleksiy. Peter, we have a question from Josh, and it's sort of similar, but it's not to the question that Oleksiy just tried to answer. What strategies can be deployed to better support Ukraine when democratic processes take time and perception and changing, and Russia doesn't play by Western rules? And that question is basically goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of our webinar about debunking, and Ukraine telling its own story.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's the most effective tool that any individual has, that the media has. It's true that the political processes are long-winded. They take time. Democracies are notoriously slow, and they often involve a lot of sort of unsavory deal making and compromises. But one thing that everyone can do, anyone who has a social media account can do, is share Ukrainian stories, tell Ukrainian stories, and share Ukrainian stories. So that is an absolutely essential part of this bigger sort of information war, the information front of the war. And I find that the people are receptive to it. Ukraine has a fascinating story, so we can talk about it in historic terms. We can talk about looking back at Ukraine's narrative, going back centuries. Or more recently, to talk about the Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, and the siege of Crimea, how those things have shaped Ukraine, and put Ukraine at the center. I think one of the big issues that we face here is this idea of denying Ukrainians agency, of portraying this war as Russia against the West, or against America, or against NATO. And in fact, the key actors in this whole drama are the Ukrainian people. It is they who have made the decision to become a European democracy. And Russia aggression is a reaction to that. So I think, by telling Ukraine's story, you can change the optics of the whole war. And remind people that the Ukrainian people here are the driving force here. They are the ones with the agency, and their story is very compelling. Again, historically so, and also in a modern sense. And in my experience, there is a lot of interest when you do tell those stories. So I would encourage everyone, even if it's just sharing articles that you enjoyed, right up to writing stuff, producing content yourself, engaging with the media. It's definitely worth it, and it can make a difference.
Thank you. And one more question for you. I think it's from Yulia, and then we'll go to Oleksiy, because I think that the next question, the question after this, is right up Alex's alley. So, Peter, how do you prevent the war fatigue among Western audiences and politicians, especially having forthcoming elections in the EU and the US in mind?
Good question. I mean, the short answer is you cannot really fully combat it. It's inevitable. I mean, it's a force of nature. You know, people get tired, and attention spans are short. So I think there again, you know, the main trick is to keep people engaged with engaging content, with reminding them why, you know, again, the human aspect. I think it's always tell human stories. You know, if you read that, you know, Putin's abducted, you know, 20,000, 30,000 children, or you know, however large the number is, it's kind of a dry statistic. But when you see these children and you see their stories, and again, you know, there might be, you know, some of the, you know, there are interviews available of these children who have been, you know, the few who have been rescued, you know, to take their stories and, you know, again, post on your platforms, share that information, put a face to the story, put a face to the headline, make it human for them, make it real. Sometimes it can also be good to put out good news. You know, people like good news. I think people are that they have a certain threshold of bad news, of sad news, of depressing news. You know, however horrific it may be, there are limits. You know, people just tend to glaze over. So sometimes it can be a matter of sharing some positive news. One of the stories that I've been trying to very actively promote in the last few months is Ukraine's success in the Black Sea, for example, which hasn't received as much attention as it might, but is really significant. And it's a legitimate story. It's a legitimately significant military development. It's a big success story. And it's a really interesting story. I mean, it's a real, you know, it's a real sort of Hollywood drama story of drones and warships and submarines being sunk. And that's also worth putting out there because it also energizes people and they say, okay, instead of just seeing horror, bombing. I mean, how many times can an audience in France or Germany or Spain engage with news of yet another bombing in Ukraine, frankly speaking? I mean, imagine how we felt perhaps when the same situation is happening in Syria. At a certain point, it all sort of, or Iraq or Afghanistan, it all blends into one. But when you pull out with good stories, say, well, look what the Ukrainians have achieved in the Black Sea. That also is a good way of breaking this sort of fatigue and engaging people, and it also gives them a sense that there can be success and it is worthwhile pushing it.
Thank you. A question for Olexiy.
About good Russians, right?
Yes, and it's coming from an anonymous attendee.
Okay.
And I'm just going to read out the question. So a lot of this chat has focused on the incredibly complex and impactful use of misinformation, political repression, and outright fear that Russia employs to keep its citizens and satellite states in line. I also hear a lot of frustration and anger from Ukrainians to the good Russian, the Russians that live their lives while their country is committing war crimes in Ukraine. My question is, what do you expect from Russian citizens in light that they live in an incredibly oppressive political and social situation where they're constantly bombarded by misinformation? What actionable steps do you think they can take in order to support Ukraine, or at least not support the war machine?
So the answer is in the question, not to support the war machine, please. Look, first of all, yes, there is debate about good Russians, but the general consensus is that there are good Russians. So people who are protesting against the war, people who, some of them emigrated, some of them took very active position, you know, even being within Russia, on different YouTube channels, which is a bit dangerous. But for example, yesterday I watched the talk about rock music in Russia, and the position which was expressed by famous Russian musical specialist on rock, Artem Troitsky, was very anti-war. You know, so I was really surprised how he did it. But look, having said that definitely there are people who express their solidarity. Some of them had to emigrate from Russia. But in general, I would say that Russian society is ill. Russian society appeared not to be able to prevent dictatorship in Russia. We had our Maidans 2 times, okay? So if we imagine that 1 million people would come to Red Square, what would happen with the regime? What I'm not talking about now, but previously, for example. But it doesn't happen. So, and the bad thing is that many Russians, they really believe in this Putin's propaganda in time when we have access to internet. Because I believe in communist propaganda because I didn't have another sources of information. But now you have these sources. And let me tell you that most Ukrainians, or many Ukrainians, we have our relatives in Russia. I have a cousin in Russia who is a clever guy with high education. And, during first days of the war, he didn't even call me. So I decided to call him. And I told him, Sasha, look, we are bombarded. And you know what he asked me? Who is bombarding you? This is Russian propaganda, which was saying that Ukrainians are bombarding themselves. But the situation now is different from the Soviet Union. You have internet. If you don't trust CNN, go to BBC. You don't trust BBC, you may go to Arabic channels, to Turkish channels, and to see these videos of what's going on in Ukraine. And for those people who would like to think, it's very easy to understand. But it's more comfortable not try to think. So my address to the Russian society is at least try to get the right information. Try to think independently from Putin propaganda. Try to view alternative sources of information and compare it. And you should avoid participating in many propagandist campaigns, because sometimes people are telling you to go to participate in the match with that. You may say, oh, sorry, my health is so bad, I cannot participate in this match. We saw during the how to say it, when candidates are put forward, and there was a candidate for Russian presidential elections, Nadezhdin, and it appeared that, yes, so many people were standing in lines, and this candidate had clear anti-war perspective. And so many people stood in lines to sign petition for his participation. And the result is so they were not afraid. And the result was that he wasn't allowed to participate in presidential campaign, which is, a sign of how Putin is afraid even of appearance of such a candidate. We know that the results would be falsified. But Putin was afraid even of Nadezhdin participating in this campaign. We saw that people appeared to pay tribute to Navalny. They were not, and from Ukrainian perspective, Navalny did, some statements which are quite contradictory regarding Ukraine, but nevertheless, he paid his life, in fighting with this regime. So people were not afraid of doing that. So try to think independently, try to be not involved into this propaganda and war machine, and try to spread the word of truth. It's dangerous, but still it's possible.
Thank you. And I'm not as optimistic as you are about like good Russians and their potential to protest against the war.
I'm not optimistic, but the question is, what can you do? At least try to find alternative sources of information and to think yourself, and then you decide what to do.
Yeah, but we've seen, every decade of Russia's existence, they had a war or many wars. And I don't recall massive anti-war protests regardless of the victim.
Chechnya, for example.
Right. So no massive anti-war protests in Russia or anywhere around the world by the Russian immigrants. So I think it goes beyond Putin, to be, tell you the truth.
Sure,
It's
I
it's
agree.
it's
I
it's an
agree.
imperial mode of thinking and
Yes.
existence, and it goes way back centuries. So, in order for all of us to find ways for the Russians to protest against the war, you have to really examine the Russian history and understand that there's not much hope, in my opinion.
I should note, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I should note that we are about 10 minutes past, but I think that we should keep going with the questions. And we have almost all of our attendees have stayed. So thank you to all of you.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that Mike, my friend Mike, just thanked us for the wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mike. We have a question from Barbara, and it goes back to my question about Israel and Gaza war. Roman's question about the Israel-Palestinian issue is, and how it's affecting perception or opinions of Ukraine is germane. The issue is already affecting the lead up the 2024 US elections. And for some is becoming a dominant in thinking about particular candidates, support, money, and ultimate votes. Olexiy rightly refers to the double standards, but is asking for logic and rule of law to prevail. But the responses to both Ukraine and Middle East today seems to be very emotional for many. Would love to hear any examples of tools that can help strengthen people's perceptions and nudge the world towards law-based and fact-based positions. Peter, would you like to handle this question?
No, I don't really understand what the point. What is the question?
What they're asking about the tools. Trying to think. Would love to hear any examples of tools that can help strengthen people's perception and nudge the world towards law-based and fact-based positions.
I mean, I guess just clarifying the reality of the situation in Ukraine. I mean, I don't think there's any need to get involved in Gaza at all for Ukraine. From a Ukrainian perspective, I would not speak about it at all. I would not comment on it one way or the other. But in terms of getting people away from emotions and towards the facts, I mean, all you can do is put the facts forward. All you can do is present the clear realities of what's going on here. I think one of the best tools that we have is to present Russia's actions and Russia's words as well. If you present to Western audiences what Russia actually says, what Putin says in Russian to Russian audiences, what Russian television broadcasts every day, this is a very powerful tool to inform Western audiences. There are a few sites and a few accounts on social media that actually do this very effectively, that follow Russian media and simply repeat what they say, simply show what they say. I think that can be a very revealing and very informative undertaking that can help international audiences understand the real nature of what Russia is all about. That can move beyond this the narratives they try to promote to international audiences. But also, I mean, if you're talking about the emotional side of things, it's very difficult to get away from that. People are driven by emotions, and we see that more and more. And in the social media world that we now live in, people really want to have their emotions, their prejudices reinforced. They're not looking to challenge their preconceived notions. And it's becoming more and more difficult to have a middle ground. It's becoming more and more challenging to, if we go back 20, 30 years, there was only 5 or 6 news broadcasts in most countries, a few newspapers, a few television broadcasts, a few radio stations that handled the news. Now most people get their news sources from a very diverse range of niche sources, and they are often very partisan. So unfortunately, I think it's very difficult to get away from that emotional side. Very, very challenging.
Thank you.
May I try to add to that? This is really tough questions, definitely. So I would say that we should use every opportunity, and Peter talked about that, about necessity to spread the facts, to spread the information. I would like also to give you example of Ukrainian 10-point peace formula. And in these 10 points, there are different points. So this country or that country shouldn't agree with all these 10 points, but you may find one point which is of specific interest for you and to participate in discussion. Nuclear safety or food security or eco safety or human rights, territorial integrity, and others. And there were several meetings for discussions at high level of this formula. During recent meeting in Davos, in Switzerland, there were 80 countries, and there were South Africa, India, and other countries of the global South. We do not know how it will happen. The idea is to conduct Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, where there would be presented results on discussions on these specific points. So again, I don't know how it will evolve. It's difficult to predict, but at least you know that 80 countries are working on that. You know, so it means there is an interest to find tools. And let me make some philosophical, question, basically, or philosophical answer, because actually the question which you are which Barbara is asking, is also, quite philosophical. How can you change the situation if it seems to be unchangeable, if it's so difficult to change? And let me tell you that, I was surprised how in the Soviet Union there were people, so-called dissidents, when most people considered that Soviet Union would continue to exist. And these dissidents, very few people, they fought for freedom, and then they participated in perestroika and moved to independence. And actually, they succeeded together with other people. Okay, so because in Soviet times it seems that we are few, we are all in prisons, in camps. What can we do with the system? And it appears that the system lost. I call myself survivor of three revolutions: 1991, 2004, 2014. And in every of these revolutions, there were, points when it seems that we are losing, but we didn't lose. The same happened with the start of full-scale invasion. Russian troops were 10 kilometers from my home in the north of Kyiv, but we didn't lose, because the principle, don't give up even if it's difficult. And believe me, it's really difficult psychologically. It's really difficult, being in Ukraine and also following all this news. It's very, very tough, but don't give up. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleksiy. And Barbara, thanks you and Peter for answering her question. Your last comments addressed the heart of my question. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Josh. I asked your question at the very beginning, but it's still up there. I hope you're satisfied with the answer. We do have one final question from Mary, and it's addressed to Peter. Peter, could you provide websites that you refer to for learning what the Russian press is saying to its domestic audience? Oleksiy, thank you for a brilliant presentation.
Do you need, well,
the main account that I follow is Julia Davis. She's on social media. She has a Facebook, she has Twitter, and she has a YouTube channel, which you'll find if you search Julia Davis with a J, Julia Davis. She's the main source, and she puts out a prodigious amount of content. And she's often the Kremlin TV hosts often criticize this because they don't like the fact that the Western audience is seeing what they say to their domestic audience. They don't appreciate that because they hope that would stay within Russia, which as it always used to, but it's not the case always now.
But be careful. Once you start following what the Russians are telling their own audience, it may do some damage to your brain and how you perceive information, especially if you're exposed to it for a very long time. Some of the things that I get to see on the Russian talk shows, especially if I have patience to watch them, it's just like full of racism, xenophobia, hatred for the world, just rampant imperialism and all of that. And that's the Western audience don't get to see that. But if they do, I'm not sure if that's gonna.
Yeah, so I have also my experience of following, Russian media because I had to, and believe me, it's very, very difficult. So when you watch Russia Today, in 5 or 10 minutes, I'm starting to believe that I'm crazy Ukrainian nationalist or Nazi, conducting all these crimes. So you need to know the facts because the Russian propaganda do not care about the facts. And if you do not know the facts, then it's very easy to be, how to say it, to be overwhelmed, with Russian propaganda. That's the problem because they are saying crazy lies. And, as Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda in Nazi Germany, said, and he said, I don't know exactly how to translate into English, but he said the craziest is the lie. There are more chances that people will believe it. And that's what Russia propaganda actually is doing. They're following the lessons of Goebbels.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think also if one of the ways that Russian propaganda works, especially for their own audience, is not to make them believe of what the government wants them to believe in, but to cause doubt about what everybody else is saying.
Right.
I think their ideal audience is the audience that doubts everything and anything, so that the Russian government can do anything they want, because there's no truth. We're living in a post-world world where like no one can be taken as truth. So if there are multiple truths, that eventually means that there are multiple lies. So no one is to be trusted, and that's the way the KGB works. And as we all know, Putin is the last KGB officer who has become president, hopefully. Anyway, I think this session has just set up the new record as the longest session that we've had in the past several months. And I not just in terms of the time, but also in terms of the attendance. I still see like 35 participants who are still
Most of our participants stayed for the entire
exactly.
thing.
And
Thank you.
I'm so humbled by your presence and your attention and your questions that you've asked us. Thank you so much. I want to thank Peter and Olexiy for becoming available for this call, knowing how popular they are on a daily basis, and I want to thank them for the knowledge and experience that they've shared. This is why these sessions are especially important to me. I learned so much from each of the guest speakers, and today that was the epitome of of the knowledge sharing
Ro-
from.
Roman, may I show this and you will explain to the audience what does it mean? Not
Please,
we.
yeah. I talk about the trident.
Anybody know? This is
Oh,
trident. This is Ukrainian coat of arms. That's what we show. We will win. This is our coat of arms.
thank you, Lexi. Sarah, did we answer all of the questions? Are we good?
I think that we did. I'm sure there's more, but we'll have future events. And next week on Friday, it's International Women's Day, and we'll be talking about women in war. And we have a very exciting guest joining us, Irina Charnahus, will be joining us. So do come back, and thank you for being here today. Please do help us keep attention on Ukraine. Don't forget Ukraine. And share this with your family, your friends, your colleagues, anyone who might be interested. I've put many times in the chat now the link to our speaker series website. You can share that website directly. People can register there, and there's a link to see recordings of our past events, including the event today, which will go up shortly after this concludes. So thank you again to Peter Dickinson and to Olexiy Haran for joining today. We know how busy you are, as Roman said. Thank you. And to Olha Nikolska and Jeffrey Glenn, who also are instrumental in helping to organize this. None of this would happen